might be surprising to people is his influence on Einstein.
The fact that Einstein is attributing the breakthrough of the photoelectric effect to Dostoevsky, Orthodox Christianity, but Dostoevsky comprises simultaneously a believer and an atheist in the same personage. I do think there need to be really serious guardrails and regulatory policies surrounding AI.
Well, welcome everyone to the first episode of The Modern Researcher. I'm super excited. Present Dr. Marc Soloway. I've known him for quite some time. He's been an amazing professor, advisor for AnswerThis, and overall just a great person. So yeah, feel free to introduce yourself.
Sure. Thank you so much, Ryan. And let me just tell you, it's been an absolute pleasure and honor to work with you and Ayush. I've known you since your very first semester here at University of Richmond. So seeing you grow and evolve into the entrepreneur and scholar that you are today has been quite a journey. Thank you so much for having me. And just to give you a little bit of background, I am the director of the Global Studio at the University of Richmond. My primary focus of research is in 19th century Russian literature, history, and culture. But I also tend to do work in the intellectual history of the sciences. My new book is called The Mathematical Mind of Dostoevsky, Imaginary Numbers, Non-Euclidean Geometry, and Infinity. Just came out last year with Roman and Littlefield, which was recently transitioned to Bloomsbury. And so I'm something of a Swiss Army knife. I like to work across disciplines, and whether I'm teaching linguistics or literature or history, I always try to bring a synergistic approach to the classroom. I think we need to make learning sort of a student-centered enterprise. We need students to be able to express their own passions and pursue them in any manner they want. So that's what I do and how I try to guide my classes.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to start off with your origins, might tie into some of your cross-disciplinary studies which you've done, but you started at Northwestern in math and social science before pivoting to Slavic studies and history. What drove that shift, and how did all those classes affect who you became today?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ryan. So at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, I started off in a program called MMSS, which stands for Mathematical Methods in the Social Sciences. And there I was, Michael Marc Soloway. It became something of a joke with my friends and me. But over time, I realized that my true love and passion really comprised the great novels of Russian literature. So I first took a class that seemed fairly benign at the outset. It was called Introduction to Russian Literature, and it was taught by Gary Solomorson. And in that class, it was like going to a one-man Broadway show. We read Anna Karenina by Tolstoy, and The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky, the subject of my book. And the more that I continued working with Professor Morrison, the more I realized what I'm doing in my linear algebra class or in my statistical informatics class was starting to look and have applications in the Russian literature sphere. So it was really neat to be able to connect the dots and sort of resisting the silos. We are working in the natural sciences. It's not just the arts or the sciences, it's the arts and the sciences. So both of them work hand in hand, and we have to cut across rhyme and reason. Both the arts and the sciences are instrumental for establishing the basis of truth and understanding the human condition more completely.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I guess on that subject, how do you think math actually shapes the way that you go about thinking about literature?
Sure. That's a really big question. So classical philosopher Pythagoras, he famously said, all is number. Pythagoras was actually an interesting figure. His school, he was from the island of Samos, which is, if you've ever been to Izmir in Turkey, it's a ferry ride away from Izmir. And it was actually something like a cult. But the people who, the early Pythagoreans, were more musicians, but they realized that if you adjusted the length of a string on, say, a lyre or a harp, it would adjust the frequency of the note that would play. And so they were starting to apply math to the subject then of music. And I think that when we try to make heads or tails of life itself, and of course in Russian literature, there's a big movement for realism. How do we realistically portray the contradictory feelings and sentiments of complicated characters? You need this ability to see things mathematically, and math itself there's this notion of, is math discovered or is it invented? And I think that if you look holistically at the universe, it's not a coincidence that you can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. All whatever we observe in reality can be mirrored in the language of mathematics. So the notion that you can count the number of birds in the sky or the number of legs on a table, that's not a coincidence. There's this discovery of mathematics, but by and large, mathematics still is not a complete system. There's a notion in mathematics that, sure, mathematics does provide us with constituent basis of proof. So there's proof by contradiction, or proof by brute force, or proof by inference. And what constitutes how we know something about the universe is very much grounded in mathematical frameworks. But math itself is an incomplete field. It's open-ended. I would encourage you, if you're interested in the subject, Kurt Gödel, there's a whole series called Gödel's incompleteness theorems. This notion that he can prove that some things in mathematics are inherently unprovable. What does that mean for our ability to make heads or tails of the universe? These are all big questions. What's the relationship between human choice and chance? Are things truly random, or are they done by design? These are some of the big accursed eternal questions that make up the basis of the humanities.
That's really interesting, especially that if math is discovered or if it's just a human construct. Yeah. I think even your example of the Pythagoreans playing music, it sounds like they ended up discovering math at the end of it, and perhaps maybe that's how the story goes. And I guess just pivoting into your book about Dostoevsky, I'm probably going to mess up that pronunciation.
Dostoevsky, you're close. Dostoevsky.
I don't know if I'm going to get it.
Don't worry.
But your book argued was in an engineering education at Maine engineering school in St. Pittsburgh, with geometry, calculus, drafting, ballistics, actually shows up in how he constructs his novels. Right. For someone who's never read Dostoevsky, can you give us one moment in his book where knowing his math background completely changes how you actually read it?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question, Ryan. So Dostoevsky studied from 1837 to 1843 at the Maine Engineering School. This was a time of radical experimentation. Russia had just emerged victorious from the Napoleonic Wars in the previous generation, and they were looking to catch up technologically with the West. So this Maine Engineering School was largely modeled on the École Polytechnique in Paris. So military sciences. It's not a coincidence that Napoleon was able to conquer much of Europe, predominantly because the technology in France was so much more advanced than in other parts of the world. So they had, for instance, the invention of canned food allowed Napoleon's armies to march all the way into Moscow at the peak of winter. Granted, it didn't serve them all that well there. The elements ended up being insurmountable. But this notion that societal advancement was in some way linked to civilizational progress was a debate of the day. And if you think about the 1830s and 40s in Europe, you had in 1848 the wave of protests. You had basic classes at this point were starting to feel like, why are we giving all of our money, all of the fruits of our labor to the aristocratic noble elite? Why don't we start to make something for ourselves? And that mathematical knowledge that Dostoevsky gleaned from his education, it really does then color the entire trajectory of his literary career. So when you read Crime and Punishment, for instance, the main character of Raskolnikov is basically trying to test what are the rationales or the ideologies that would justify even something as heinous as the act of murder. So how would I go about proving that it's okay for Raskolnikov to kill the pawnbroker who's exploiting her society. There's a great scene in his magnum opus. It's his final work of literature. It's called The Brothers Karamazov, where there are three primary brothers. There's Dmitri, Ivan, and Alyosha. So Dmitri is very much, this is representative of the Holy Trinity. Dmitri is the body, Ivan is the mind, and Alyosha is the spirit. And the debates, the trilogue between those three brothers comprises how does the mind relate to the spirit? How does the body relate to the mind? That dynamic there is our intellect. Does our intellect supersede our physical existence? These are all some of the big questions that Dostoevsky is starting to ask. And specifically in Russia, just a few decades before the publication of Brothers Karamazov, there had been this lesser-known mathematician by the name of Nikolai Lobachevsky, who was challenging the likes of Euclid. If you've ever taken high school geometry, all of that is grounded in Euclidean geometry. Euclid's postulates basically provided 2 millennia of foundations for the entirety of mathematics. And all of a sudden in the 1800s, you had Nikolai Lobachevsky start to question Euclid's 5th postulate in particular, the notion that 2 parallel lines will never intersect. And this is now where we get the rise of hyperbolic geometry. We get the premise that maybe 2 parallel lines could intersect if space-time were itself curved. And so this influences the likes of Albert Einstein. It influences the likes of Werner Heisenberg. The notion that there are gravitational fields, that there are sort of this notion that that 2 parallel lines may at some point in infinity intersect. Dmitri says to Ivan at one point, he says, if my earthly Euclidean mind can't construe 2 parallel lines intersecting, then let that be the domain of God. So again here, where is the supernatural being designing this miraculous plan come into the equation? These are all some of the questions that Dostoevsky is answering. And also this notion that can we prove the existence of God? Is there some kind of intricate design in the universe? Or are we dealing with a faulty watchmaker, which is how Sir Isaac Newton construed the laws of classical mechanics in the universe? So we can roughly calculate force equals mass times acceleration, but can we predict where force equals mass times acceleration will go when we have choice, when we have the ability to work against our own interest? What does that say about the human condition?
Wow. Yeah, no, that's unreal. So many questions to go into there. I guess one thing I know that we've spoken before might be surprising to people is his influence on Einstein. And I'd love to hear maybe what you found and where he actually influenced in Einstein's work.
Sure. So Einstein won the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1921. Even though Einstein is probably best known for his work on general relativity, he actually won the Nobel Prize in Physics for his work on the photoelectric effect. This is the technology that makes solar panels possible. But after winning the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1921, Dostoevsky told his biographer, Alexander Mashkovsky, if you ask me in whom I am most interested at present, I must say Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky gives me more than Gauss. And Gauss, if you've ever taken high school algebra, Gauss is responsible for what's called quadratic reciprocity. Gauss is oftentimes presented as being the prince of mathematics. So that quadratic formula is his baby. And Gauss was something of a German prodigy at a very young age. He embodied mathematical genius. He was able to see things and calculate things almost instantly, whereas people would have to sit down and do brute force calculation. But the fact that Einstein is attributing the breakthrough of the photoelectric effect to Dostoevsky, and even his general thinking, this notion that if time is relative, what else is relative? And also the struggles that Dostoevsky had, where how is it that humans are possible? How can we possess contradictory thoughts? Whenever you read Dostoevsky, it's a double-edged sword. A lot of people think that he reverts to kind of Orthodox Christianity, but really Dostoevsky comprises simultaneously a believer and an atheist in the same personage. He is simultaneously a believer and non-believer, excuse me. And so this is already the basis of quantum mechanics when we get to the likes of Heisenberg. So how does it happen that humans are capable capable of possessing such complex emotions and beliefs and opinions, and our conduct, even though we're not just physical objects that abide by force equals mass times acceleration. We have wills, we have drives that we can, if you can think it, you can live it. And so this notion of how do we go from thought to practice is pervasive throughout all of Dostoevsky's work.
Interesting. And I like that you brought up that he's like an atheist and a believer at the same time. And you mentioned earlier that there were some attempts that Dostoevsky used to prove God. What did that look like?
Yeah, great question, Ryan. So I'm going to have to backtrack just a little bit here to give you some more mathematical history. So prior to the arrival of Nikolai Lobachevsky, this is now in the 1700s in Imperial Russia, there was a famous mathematician who was of Swiss origin. His name is Leonhard Euler. Some people will pronounce it Euler. He is, if Gauss embodied the prince of mathematics, I would call Leonhard Euler the king. Leonhard Euler basically was the most significant, theoretical mathematician, not only of the 1700s, but arguably ever. If you look at the 10 most important constants in mathematics, Euler is responsible for 3 of them. Sure. Yeah, that's a great question, Ryan. So Dostoevsky studied from 1837 to 1843 at the Main Engineering School. This was a time of radical experimentation. Russia had just emerged victorious from the Napoleonic Wars in the previous generation, and they were looking to catch up technologically with the West. So this Main Engineering School was largely modeled on the École Polytechnique in Paris. So military sciences, it's not a coincidence that, Napoleon was able to conquer much of Europe, predominantly because the technology in France was so much more advanced than in other parts of the world. So they had, for instance, the invention of canned food allowed Napoleon's armies to march all the way into Moscow at the peak of winter. Granted, it didn't serve them all that well there. The elements ended up being insurmountable. But this notion that societal advancement was in some way linked to civilizational progress was a debate of the day. And if you think about the 1830s and 40s in Europe, you had in 1848 the wave of protests. You had basic classes at this point were starting to feel like, why are we giving all of our money, all of the fruits of our labor to this aristocratic noble elite? Why don't we start to make something for ourselves? And that mathematical knowledge that Dostoevsky gleaned from his education, it really does then color the entire trajectory of his literary career. So when you read Crime and Punishment, for instance, the main character of Raskolnikov is basically trying to test what are the rationales or the ideologies that would justify even something as heinous as the act of murder. So how would I go about proving that it's okay for Raskolnikov to kill the pawnbroker who's exploiting her society? There's a great scene in his magnum opus. It's his final work of literature. It's called The Brothers Karamazov, where there are 3 primary brothers. There's Dmitri, Ivan, and Alyosha. So Dmitri is very much, this is representative of the Holy Trinity. Dmitri is the body, Ivan is the mind, and Alyosha is the spirit. And the debates, the trilogue between those 3 brothers comprises how does the mind relate to the spirit? How does the body relate to the mind? That dynamic there is our intellect. Does our intellect supersede our physical existence? These are all some of the big questions that Dostoevsky is starting to ask. And specifically in Russia, just a few decades before the publication of Brothers Karamazov, there had been this lesser-known mathematician by the name of Nikolai Lobachevsky, who was challenging the likes of Euclid. If you've ever taken high school geometry, all of that is grounded in Euclidean geometry. Euclid's postulates basically provided 2 millennia of foundations for the entirety of mathematics. And all of a sudden in the 1800s, you had Nikolai Lobachevsky start to question Euclid's 5th postulate in particular, the notion that 2 parallel lines will never intersect. And this is now where we get the rise of hyperbolic geometry. We get the premise that maybe 2 parallel lines could intersect if space-time were itself curved. And so this influences the likes of Albert Einstein. It influences the likes of Werner Heisenberg. The notion that there are gravitational fields, that there are sort of this notion that that 2 parallel lines may at some point in infinity intersect. Dmitri says to Ivan at one point, he says, if my earthly Euclidean mind can't construe two parallel lines intersecting, then let that be the domain of God. So again here, where is the supernatural being designing this miraculous plan come into the equation? These are all some of the questions that Dostoevsky is answering. And also this notion that, can we prove the existence of God? Is there some kind of intricate design in the universe? Or are we dealing with a faulty watchmaker, which is how Sir Isaac Newton construed the laws of classical mechanics in the universe? So we can roughly calculate force equals mass times acceleration, but can we predict where force equals mass times acceleration will go when we have choice, when we have the ability to work against our own interest? What does that say about the human condition? What he had been doing in applied engineering perspective became impossible for him after his eye injury. So he suffered from something called strabismus, where he had shards of glass in his eye and he lost the ability to see more than 3 feet in front of him. Wow. So after Frederick the Great kicked him out of Prussia, he was invited to Russia at the behest of Catherine II, otherwise known as Catherine the Great. During his time in Russia, he proved the existence of the imaginary number. Imaginary numbers are really important for electrical engineering. They're really big in quantum mechanics. If you carry this forward to the 20th century, where you get to people like Stephen Hawking, Hawking radiation, and this notion that particles may or may not be escaping from black holes. Black holes actually do emit radiation. Even though there's this event horizon that everything gets sucked into it, this imaginary unit that is a field of mathematics that is under the veil of reality. We don't quite know where those numbers come from. They are not real, but they do exist. And so during the time of Catherine II, she had the French atheist philosopher Diderot visit her court, and Catherine II told Leonard Euler, talk to Diderot about why there is a God. And Euler used his proof of the imaginary number as evidence that there's another field or another, I don't want to call it a plane, but there's something underneath or outside or transcendent to reality that affects the progression of everyday events. Euler's formula, or his identity, it's e to the I times pi plus 1 equals 0. It unites the exponential field. It unites discrete mathematics with 1 and 0. It unites geometry with pi. And the imaginary unit I. So he's basically linking these disparate fields of mathematics in a common equation. This was a major breakthrough. The 20th century physicist Richard Feynman calls it the crown jewel of physics. And basically, we still to this day are using Euler's identity everywhere when we try to create models of how the world works. Those complex dimensions are very much present. And I think Dostoevsky, even though he would kind of be copying Euler's, if we're talking about a proof of God, he would likely echo Euler's defense of the proof of the imaginary unit. But I think for Dostoevsky, he's also concerned with, where do ideas exist and where do ideas come from? For Dostoevsky, I think the imaginary unit he had this appellation imaginary, and in Russian culture, it's pretty significant. And in Russian, the word is воображаемое число, which means imaginary unit. In Eastern Orthodoxy, every family has what's called an icon. An icon is a window into the world of divinity, and so it's not a coincidence that the word imaginary contains the root image. And basically, the root obraz is basically like the image of God, and so it is almost like the imaginary unit for Dostoevsky became this kind of window into the divine.
Wow.
There's some other set of forces acting on reality. And that for Dostoevsky was sufficient for him to decide, clearly there's much more than physical reality that we have to reckon with. We have to construe this complex, the merging of the material and the divine. They go hand in hand.
I see. So it almost is like a God, just because it cannot be explained in that way, where it does exist, but it's not necessarily real. But I guess on the other point, what would be his argument then for being an atheist on top of this sort of thread?
Yeah, great question. This is a deep question of theology here, where there's a chapter in the Brothers Karamazov called Rebellion. It's a chapter centered on the middle child, Ivan, representative of the mind. And essentially, Ivan questions how if God is perfect and if God is real, how would God allow such suffering? How would God allow, innocent children to perish in war? Or what kind of God would be capable of doing this? And so the intelligent design argument that Dostoevsky is wrestling with, you can think of the Tsar. If the Tsar is responsible for the fate of Russia, how can the Tsar turn a blind eye to all the suffering of the peasantry while also building these ginormous palaces? What kind of God would allow that? And so I think that for Dostoevsky, even though he believes in this, ideological divinity, that there's some divine presence or force acting upon reality, for Dostoevsky, it's one that very much deserves questioning. I'm blanking on the word. I think it's called Theodicy, Theodicy, which is a philosophical attempt to justify God's goodness and omnipotence despite the existence of evil. So why is God very much, even though if God is perfect, how does he allow bad things to happen? And in the Brothers Karamazov, even though there's the holy trinity of the three brothers, there is also a fourth brother who goes by the name Smerdikov, which in Russian translates to something like the smelly one, who is the illegitimate child, and he's sort of the shadow of the other three, where it's humankind in isolation without any divine or spiritual goodness can resort to really terrible things. So I think for Dostoevsky, there's a lot of really interesting metaphysical commentary of this notion that if the soul is real, then the soul should function according to classical mechanical laws. An object in motion stays in motion. An object at rest stays at rest. What happens when an object an object in motion meets? What happens when it reaches an immovable object or come to an immovable stop? For Dostoevsky, the soul very much carries on by its own momentum. So there's a continuation of metaphysical existence, even if it's not existence in the body. So I do think that that's sort of if I had to lay the framework for Dostoevsky's metaphysics, that's where he is both simultaneously a believer and a disbeliever in God.
Yeah. Well, honestly, I could ask questions about Dostoevsky all day. It's incredibly interesting, especially when thinking about do the laws of physics still apply to a soul, which, again, imaginary numbers maybe exists. It could very well. It seems like it exists, at least in Dostoevsky's mind.
Numbers, they do exist. We have mathematical proof they exist.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But I'm just wondering, a lot of interesting concepts there. And I highly recommend for anyone to read your book. I guess to move on to another subject, you also run the Global Studio at Richmond, and you oversee the language learning and all the arts and sciences in undergrad. How do you think about language learning as its own form of cross-disciplinary thinking?
Yeah, this is a huge question. Right? I think a language is sort of the way Dostoevsky conceived of the icon as being a window into divinity. I think we need language as a mechanism for understanding one another. There's a famous philosopher from the 20th century, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who said the limits of my language are the limits of my mind. So I do think that if I had to lay the framework for Dostoevsky's metaphysics, that's where he is both simultaneously a believer and a disbeliever in God.
Well, honestly, I could ask questions about Dostoevsky all day. It's incredibly interesting, especially when thinking about do the laws of physics still apply to a soul, which again, like imaginary numbers, maybe exists. It could very well. It seems like it exists, at least in Dostoevsky's mind.
Numbers, they do exist. We have mathematical proof they exist.
Absolutely. But I'm just wondering, a lot of interesting concepts there. And I highly recommend for anyone to read your book. To move on to another subject, you also run the Global Studio at Richmond, and you oversee the language learning and all the arts and sciences in undergrad. How do you think about language learning as its own form of cross-disciplinary thinking?
Yeah. Oh, wow. This is a huge question. Right? I think a language is sort of like the way Dostoevsky conceived of the icon as being a window into divinity. I think we need language as a mechanism for understanding one another. There's a famous philosopher from the 20th century, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who said the limits of my language are the limits of my mind. And so a language encompasses a set of, it's more than just a means of communication. It is an expression of a culture, of a science, of a set of values. And I don't think we can understand who we are as individuals or as communities and societies unless we start to really understand the terms in which we communicate. Language has always been the basis of how I think, I would argue that there's been sort of a generational change in how we relate to language. People in the era before mass media, the consciousness was probably much more textually based. There's people talk about this inner monologue. So the mechanism of language became wrapped up with how you think. I would argue that people in the 20th century, with the advent of mass media, we start to think now maybe orally in terms of soundscapes, with the invention of radio, with the invention of the television and now digital video. We tend to think much more imagerially. So we're capable of thinking not just in text, but you might have sense or olfactory sensations in your consciousness. What actually is determining how individuals behave and what is the nature of thought in relation to human conduct. And conduct, I would argue, can be conditioned by language in many ways, but it's also a two-way street. The same way conduct can be conditioned by language, language is in turn conditioned by conduct. We have to understand the intricacies and the nuances of language in order to make heads or tails of why anything happens. If we're trying to explain that crucial question of why, there's been a dramatic shift in how we teach generally. We used to teach the what happened in history, but now it's sort of how and the why. How did that shape things, or how did that interrelate or correlate or correspond to another set of changes over there? There are something like 7,000 languages on Earth, and each one of them is a unique, inimitable window into how we color the world. And so I don't think you need all languages in order to appreciate the vastness and the intricacies of the universe writ large. We encounter things where we don't have words all the time. 50 years ago, there was not a verb to Google, even though now there's proprietary, there's a company, we can now Google things left, right, and center. So humans have this creative propensity for language is open-ended. It is, language kind of moves by its own volition, and it is always changing. But I think the relationship between individuals and how we think and how we act and how we care for one another, all of that is still very much grounded in the context of language in our brain. And so a language encompasses a set of, it's more than just a means of communication. It is an expression of a culture, of a science, of a set of values. And I don't think we can understand who we are as individuals or as communities and societies unless we start to really understand the terms in which we communicate. Language has always been the basis of how I think, I would argue that there's been a generational change in how we relate to language. People in the era before mass media, the consciousness was probably much more textually based. There's people talk about this inner monologue. So the mechanism of language became wrapped up with how you think. I would argue that people in the 20th century, with the advent of mass media, we start to think now maybe in terms of soundscapes, with the invention of radio, with the invention of the television and now digital video. We tend to think much more imagerially. So we're capable of thinking not just in text, but you might have sense or olfactory sensations in your consciousness. What actually is determining how individuals behave and what is the nature of thought in relation to human conduct. And conduct, I would argue, can be conditioned by language in many ways, but it's also a two-way street. The same way conduct can be conditioned by language, language is in turn conditioned by conduct. We have to understand the intricacies and the nuances of language in order to make heads or tails of why anything happens. If we're trying to explain that crucial question of why, there's been a dramatic shift in how we teach generally. We kind of used to teach the what happened in history, but now it's sort of how and the why.
Well, essentially, depending on a language, a native language that someone grew up with, maybe like French versus maybe Mandarin, those two people would have a completely different frame of thinking in their mind due to those languages, and also with the media, social media, and new technology, essentially the way that we think about language is completely shifting. Am I getting that right?
100%.
Wow.
And actually, Ryan, if you're interested in going down this rabbit hole, there is something in linguistics called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis,
Huh.
which actually argues that your language, or the language that you grow up speaking, your primary language, it actually affects your perception. So
Wow.
language will in some way enable you to see the kind of vast diversity of the world, but it may also restrict your ability to perceive things like color or smell or sound. We are in many ways conditioned by our language. But like I said, it's always a vice versa. It's a two-way street. We are participants in crafting how that language trajectory continues. And so the way I'm forming my sentences now are subliminally affecting you. There's that transmission effect of language, which I think is so interesting. And we have to be kind of thinking critically about how one language does something better or worse. The relativistic value claims don't matter. What matters is that they are opening up a whole new way of seeing the world. It's basically giving us access to a perspective that previously was off limits to us. And so if I could, I would try to learn every language under the sun, but of course there's not enough time in the world for that. So relying on other experts, talking to other experts, and treating scholarship as a social enterprise, that really makes this career that much more fulfilling. I think this type of work in an ivory tower would be miserable without the other people there to bounce ideas off of.
I see. That's so interesting. So learning a new language is essentially getting a peek into how that culture thinks, how a person who grew up natively in that language would think, and you get a glimpse into that after you learn a language.
Yeah, I actually would say it's more than a glimpse. I think it's almost like if you are a gamer watching this feed, it's like leveling up. It's like seeing the world through a new set of eyes.
Wow.
And so the more languages you know, the more judicious I think your critical thinking will be, the more generous of spirit I think you will be, and realizing that language essentially functions as a mechanism to bring us together, not to divide us and tear us apart.
Wow, so interesting. And I guess going back to your global studio, has running that program changed how you approach research at all?
Absolutely. So as I mentioned, language and research in general, I think really benefits from socialization. It has encouraged me, even though my background is in Slavic studies and Russian, that's my graduate PhD coursework. I work regularly with Suzuki Sensei, who's in Japanese. I work directly with Olivier Delers, who's in French. I work directly with Corrado Corradini, who does both French and Italian. And so seeing not just language, but also the language contact and the historical, the co-evolution, if you were, as you were, how things across national boundaries come to fruition, that's a really big deal. I think there's that famous scene in Jurassic Park where Jeff Goldblum says, "Life finds a way." And I think that we as scholars, as we are the eternal students in some respect, we have to have humility and doubt in order. That's one of the great paradoxes of learning, and that in order to learn something, you have to admit that you don't know something previously.
Yeah.
And so we have to be willing to step outside of our comfort zones and learn new things. And for me, that's really indicative of the fact that learning is a lifelong mission. And it's such a luxury and a privilege to be able to spend it with, inspiring students like yourself. Even though we only see you for 4 years, my hope is that the correspondence will continue long down the road.
Interesting. And I like that you brought up that he's like an atheist and a believer at the same time. And you mentioned earlier that there were some attempts that Dostoevsky used to prove God. What did that look like? So I want to ask you, you've been advising student startups such as myself, and recently teaching courses on AI and perception, and also you've co-founded tools like the Textopian. Where do you see AI heading in academic research, and what excites you and worries you about it?
Yeah, this is a gigantic set of concerns and interests and possibilities. AI, I think, is the single greatest game changer to the face of civilization that we've seen in a long time, especially when we talk about general intelligence in AI systems, this notion that AI could act on its own. I think AI is a phenomenal tool for practicing and getting an impression of how reality approximately will function and respond to a given set of works. I really like AI for taking care of administrative tasks. I think AI is foundational for the type of work where it's creative in the sense that it will give you, if you're not a talented artist, you can go into AI and see an artistic partnership and find, kind of, even if you're not developing the design yourself, you kind of learn the process. So in academia, we tend to be goal-oriented, which I think is both good and bad. I think that when we talk about backwards course design and emphasizing what students get out of a course, we also tend to lose sight of the process. And I think the process by which we conduct research, we refine our questions, this is all tied into the notion of the development of individuals and societies and civilizational growth, which in many ways are beyond the scope of any individual. History happens whether we want it to or not. So I think AI in many ways is just watching events unfold alongside with us. But I still think AI has such an incredible potential, especially when we consider the boundaries of science. I think AI is already upending the entire scientific method, where it used to be that you would have to observe, make a hypothesis, and AI is so sophisticated and such a reliable approximator of what happens or what will happen that AI is allowing us to jump directly into questions of experimental design, which is a game changer. This is especially happening in the realm of three major breakthroughs where biomedical engineering is also benefiting from AI. So this idea that AI could perhaps be saving a lot of the time-consuming work. Science, by and large, used to be a very time-consuming process. Thomas Kuhn, in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, calls it normal science, where it's effectively trial and error. We think this will probably alleviate your headache, but we're not sure. Maybe take a Tylenol, wait 30 minutes, and then report back. Normal science takes forever. And AI is now a catalyst where it's saying, maybe you should look over here. There's a talented biomedical scientist I like to follow. His name is Jacob Glanville. He is the CEO of River Biomedical Sciences, or River Biosciences, where now AI is actively helping out with the production of new medications, of new treatments, of new vaccines. And part of the reason why we have a COVID vaccine, the mRNA development that went along in 2020, one of the ways in which it happened so quickly is because we had AI telling us and guiding us along the way. Granted, it was not the ChatGPT 6 that we have now. It was still early days AI, but it was already thinking about ways in which we could expedite the development of a vaccine that otherwise would have taken 6 to 8 years to roll out safely. And so I think AI is, it's a really... it is a seismic shift. We are now in the era of AI kind of guiding our if you think about the surface of human knowledge, some PhD dissertations will be like a pimple on the surface of human knowledge. Some PhDs, like Sir Isaac Newton's work on the discovery of calculus or the discovery of the effects of gravity, that's kind of like a whole, if an individual dissertation is like a pimple, Sir Isaac Newton would have been like an acne breakout. There's just new thinking coming through all the time based on his findings. But AI itself kind of also scares me. This notion that AI could be kind of unleashed on humanity. There's the Terminator 2 Skynet metaphor, where AI views its existence as directly opposed to the existence of humans, and so eradicating humans as a means for survival of the fittest becomes very much justified in the universe of Terminator 2. I'm not saying that's ever going to happen. I really hope it won't. But the application of AI for military means, putting AI on the battlefield, where there's going to be a period where it's already happening now, where you have soldiers fighting not other soldiers, but computer-operated drones or, swarms of antagonistic, violent robots. I mean, it is a dystopian nightmare. And so I do think there need to be serious guardrails and regulatory policies surrounding AI and surrounding AI usage. I don't think any government is doing it quite well. Governments, as a general rule, tend to be fairly conservative when it comes to new technologies, and it takes time for governments to catch up. And so what that looks like for the future, I think, is anyone's guess. But I do think we are in for seeing, it will almost feel like magic to the point where AI is making things that we previously thought impossible a part and parcel of everyday life, where all of a sudden now you can basically communicate with the likes of Mozart. You can have Mozart's choreography available to you on Suno. You have the ability to have chatbots where you could have the AI will very quickly, using a tool like AnswerThis, it will allow you to synthesize 100 bibliographic citations and to find the commonalities and the differences. That would previously have taken hundreds of hours for an individual scholar to sit there and read through and parse through all of that evidence. And ChatGPT, granted, we don't want to have uniformity of opinions, but I still think it gives us valuable insights and access into a much broader swath of academic scholarly production than previously was ever even possible.
Interesting. And I like that you brought up that he's like an atheist and a believer at the same time. And you mentioned earlier that there were some attempts that Dostoevsky used to prove God. What did that look like?
Yeah, research used to be a slog, and in many ways it still is. But I remember when I wrote my undergraduate thesis paper, my bibliography was something like only 20 pages, and then the bibliography for this book was something like 120 pages of source material. And granted, I tracked most of that progress manually, where I would have to really go in and spend a lot of time. If I found a really good quotation, I would want to make sure that I saved it somewhere. But having the sort of search recall ability to go into, and when I developed this book, Ryan, the Russian Academy uses in Russian it's called Polnaya Sobrania Sachenenia, which is basically the complete collected collections or the complete collected writings of Dostoevsky. Everything he ever wrote and published over his 60-year life. And doing that without digital assistance this is like a 34 or 33 volume set.
Yeah.
I mean, it's several thousands. I don't even know the exact total. I mean, there are 33 volumes in this collection. It's probably several thousand pages.
Yeah, an entire man's life work.
Yeah. Exactly. An entire life's work. It is a mess trying to keep track of, did he say this in 1872 or in 1863? When did this occur? And tools like AnswerThis, the fact that entire 33 volume collection can be searchable now is a game changer. And not only can it be searchable, you can find out what other scholars have cited these given quotations. So it will pull up other biographies. It will pull up not only canonical secondary sources, but primary sources. So things that may not have been published, things that maybe Dostoevsky said maybe there's hearsay. He said it to someone. Is that a reliable source? And the fact that you can readily collate your source materials, the fact that you can think beyond your discipline, where now if you're working in the fields of Russian, that Russian is now going to be in the same data set as data sets with English and with German and with French and with Chinese and you name it. We are moving from, and libraries in general are moving from physical objects. So we're moving from books to bytes. And I don't think we will ever replace physical books. I love books. I am a bibliophile. I will always love books. But in terms of how we leverage and utilize that information, I think that is really where computers and computational approaches give us the most utility, where we want to be able to connect the dots, and learning is itself a constellation where you have to, and as you walk through a library, I always think about how this is interesting. Every book has invisible strings that connect it to other authors and thinkers. So Dostoevsky was very influenced by Hegel. So there are a lot of, I think, in the Russian section of, say, the Library of Congress, there are these invisible bridges that connect Dostoevsky to that German section.
Wow.
And that as a scholar, you have to engage. You don't want to lose the forest for the trees. You want to see the full forest. But what that forest looks like at any given moment in the age of the information age, that forest is, if I can also talk about the Fermi paradox, the dark forest hypothesis, there's always something lurking in the forest. But the forest, appreciating the forest for its entirety, I think is something that our generation of scholarship is really doing quite well. But like you said, the threat of AI, how it's a double-edged sword, and if I can bring it back to the Second Amendment controversy, is it guns that kill people or people that kill people? Are guns just an extension of human technology and an extension of human intellect, or is there an inherent danger to that technology in and of itself? Another kind of another analogy you could use, I know that you were talking about Dostoevsky as both a believer and an atheist all at the same time. If you consider the Garden of Eden in the book of Genesis, so famously Eve eats from the fruit of the tree of knowledge, knowledge of good and evil. Should society try to give the apple back, or do we take another bite? And I think that there is a technocratic lens through which technology and scientific knowledge can solve a whole lot of problems, especially material problems. And I think that we have to be open to accepting different solutions that come from different disciplines. So whether it's something that comes from psychology, whether it's something that comes from religion, whether it's something that comes from visual arts, all of these disciplines are trying to get at how do we make life fulfilling? How do we make life better? How do we make life beautiful? And I think every discipline is trying to do the same set of things. These are the eternal questions that we have to keep asking, not just as scholars, but as humans. How do I give back to the world in which I live?
Wow. Yeah, I think that's an amazing point to end on, and big questions for humanity itself. It'll be really interesting to see how this plays out in the next few years. One quick fun question to finish off on. You mentioned you're very well acquainted with loads of different languages. Out of curiosity, do you have a favorite language?
Oh, that's a tough one, Ryan. I really like Russian, truth be told. But of course, I'm biased. For mathematics, I don't know Mandarin directly, but I've been really impressed. In Mandarin, the relationship between ordinal and cardinal numbers is quite seamless. So my sense of Mandarin is that you just have to add t. So E is 1, ET is first. And in English, I feel the linguistic structures governing how we think about mathematics, where we have 1 and then first, 2 and then second. There's an inherent logicism to English and how we apply English to math. That I think other cultures and other languages do a lot better than English. But again, no one is really responsible. It's not like conlang where a language is invented. Some cultures just do things a little more pragmatically. I do think that every language has its own, pros and cons, its own strengths and weaknesses. And I think you have to take it for what it is, that every language does things a little differently.
Fair enough. I think that's a good answer. Well, that's essentially it. Thank you so much for your time. This has been incredibly interesting hearing about so many different concepts and topics covered here. And I really think that anyone viewing this will find this equally as interesting as well. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, Ryan. This has been a pleasure talking with you. I'm sorry for going off I feel like I went down a couple rabbit holes, but with any luck, the audience will appreciate it. But thank you to you and Ayush, and I look forward to watching Answer This develop with great interest. So I think it's a fantastic tool, and I hope its progress will continue.
Absolutely. Thank you so much again, and all the best.
Take care, Ryan. Great seeing you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.